In this example, we're going to look at building a module that pulls coupon codes from a flat file located somewhere on the server. And in order to do this, we first need to understand how does Magento's coupon process work. So I've created a half off coupon here that I've applied, and as you can see, it gives me half off of an order. Now I want to look at the Magento code base and determine what part of the code is activating that. So I'm going to look at app, code, core, mage. And then somewhere within here, I know that this functionality resides. I've looked around in the code base a little bit, and let's say I know that it's contained within the sales rule module. I go in, look at the models, and I would, at this point, basically take my best guess as to which of these models is going to handle the coupon functionality. It looks like the validator functionality could possibly do that. So I'm going to open that file, going to look at all the different methods, and I've looked at, there's some of these are called process. I'm going to just filter down and look at this process method here. Now, when doing debug or development like this, it's important to just take a quick look at a method and say, okay, what does this method do? On initial scan, it looks like this could be the coupon code functionality. And in order to determine that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a breakpoint on the first line of this method, and then switch back to my browser. I'm going to turn on debugging using this xdebug helper. All this does is it just sets a cookie, and so that whenever you refresh the page, Eclipse knows to start a debugging session. I'm going to go refresh the page, switch back to Eclipse, and as you can see here, Eclipse has changed its perspective. Right now, this is showing the debugging perspective. Right over here, I have my code, and you can see this green line right here indicates where the execution has halted. It's halted where I set my breakpoint. Over here I have all the variables, and up here I have my call stack. First, let's take a look at the call stack. Basically what this does is it just shows you all the code that has been run up to the point of that code. At the very beginning we have our index.php file, then we have that calls mage run, which calls mage core model app run, which calls another method, which calls another method, so on and so forth. We look back at the current line of execution, and looking at our variables here, we have three different types of variables. We have our super global variables, which are all of the super globals that PHP initializes. And if we want, we can go in and expand these arrays and look at the values. We have our second set of variables, which is these are all of the variables inside of the local scope of this method. As you can see, most of them are uninitialized, which means that they're referenced at some point in this method, but they do not have a value set to them yet. And then the third section is this, which is the object context. And if you expand that, you can see all of the properties of the current object context. The most significant being the data property, which we'll go into in a little bit. Okay, so the code has halted execution on this line. I can now step through this method, and as I'm stepping through, the variables as they're initialized, for example, this item price variable on the right-hand side, it's currently uninitialized. When I step down to this next line of code, item price value changes to 65. Now, as with most debuggers, you can go in and change that value, and as you continue to walk through the code, item price will be seen as 65. So I'm going to walk through. Now let's say I reach a line of code and I want to figure out what does this get rules do? Well, I could either go in, click on that, or find that method and read through the code, or I can just step into it, which then shows me the next line of code, and I can then walk through this method to see what it does. If I want to return to my previous line, I can do a step return, and then continue walking down through the code. Now, what I'm going to be doing, if I'm trying to understand how to implement this functionality, I want to figure out, okay, how does this process method work? So I'm going to continue stepping through, paying attention to the variables as they're changing on the right-hand side, and I've gotten to this switch case here. I'm going to jump down, and it looks like that rule that I set up that was 50% off gets handled by this case right here. So I'm going to pay a special attention to this code right here, figure out how it works. So it looks like it sets a discount amount and base discount amount variables. Going to continue stepping through. Then I jump down to this next line of code here, and at this point I will have determined, okay, if I wanted to, I could go in and override this validator class, override this process method, implement my own functionality. But as most of you probably know, it's not ideal to go in and override methods if at all possible. You generally want to use observers to implement custom functionality. So as I scroll down here, I see that there's this result object getting created, and it gets passed to a sales rule validator process method, which means that if I set up an event observer and I receive this result object and make changes to it, then hopefully the coupon codes would actually get applied. So what I can do just to test is I'm going to jump to my next line of code, and this result array or object right here, I can go in and currently it's set to 37.5 and 32.5. Let's just say, for example, I implemented an observer to change that result, and let's change it to 47 and 32.5. Then I don't want to continue walking through the rest of the code in the Magento installation. What I'm going to do is hit resume, which will run until there's another breakpoint or until it reaches the end of the code. Switch back to Firefox, and as you can see here, that 4750 was applied. This now gives me the ability to go in and create my custom module that ties into that sales rule validated process observer, and I did all that by just quickly understanding how Magento works by walking through it with the debugger. Now, obviously, I could have also read through this code and just determined that using my mind as a PHP processor, but sometimes for some functionality it just makes more sense to walk through it and let PHP do all the difficult work of calculating the flow of logic. The next thing I want to discuss is a fairly new feature to Eclipse. It's called the inspect feature. I'm going to switch back to Firefox, refresh the page to start a new debug session, and it pauses on this line of code here. I'm going to go in and create a new line. Now realize that this is in the middle of PHP interpreting this file. I'm going to go in, type some code. I've typed this code here. Now obviously this is not the code that PHP is actually looking at to render, so it's going to skip over this line of code if I continue walking through it. However, I can go to run inspect, and if I select this code that's selected, if I hit inspect, it's going to show me the value that would return. This can be really helpful if you're wanting to test what different code would return, but you don't actually want to change the code, go back in, save it, refresh it. You can do a lot of this in line. For another example is if I go in and select item get quote, Command-Shift-I is the hotkey for inspect. This shows me what item get quote returns. Now obviously I could have just walked down this line and I could have seen what quote was set to, but there are certain times where if for example, right, this code right here isn't getting assigned to any variables, so I can't just walk through the code and see what this gets assigned to. So I can go in, select this code right here, Command-Shift-I, and I can see what the value is. It can also, it's really especially helpful whenever you're using it on getters, because you can run it and see that it returns 65. I could then go in, change things in my local variable scope. For example, I could go in and change stuff inside of this data or variables in other locations, play around with it, then rerun the code and see how it would affect things. So it can be really helpful to just test code out really quickly in a live environment. One more thing I want to show you with this is just to give you another example of how it works and how it actually runs this code in a real-time environment. I typed up this code here. I'm going to run it, and then I'm going to hit play, which resumes execution. Switch back to Firefox, and as you can see, that test was actually output. And that was all from changing code and running it in a real debug session. The next thing I want to discuss is a custom file that I created that is inside of a sandbox.php file, which I will cover later in the presentation. I have loading a basic product model and a product collection. I'm going to go in, set a breakpoint on this product, go to my sandbox.php file, refresh the page, and execution halts on the product. I'm going to jump to the next line, and I'm switching over to my variables pane. I'm going to maximize that with Command M. And this is something that's very, very useful when looking at Magento product models, is understanding some of the more important properties in that model. And the most important is the data model, or the data property rather. It's an array of all values that are on this model. If I expand it, Eclipse breaks it down into the first 30 keys and then the 31st through the 46th keys. I expand that, and this is all the data that's available on this model. This is, so if I wanted, for example, this type ID value right here is the equivalent of doing product get type ID or product get data type ID. So this data property is where Magento stores all those values. It can be very helpful when I'm trying to understand Magento functionality. You can go in, set a breakpoint at a certain point where a model gets loaded, and see the values that are set on that. As I discussed before, you can also go in, change those values, and that gets reflected wherever this model is referenced in the entire system, because in PHP, objects are stored by reference and passed by reference. And so if you update this in one location, anywhere else in the system that references that, this price should cascade through to that. There are a number of other properties on the product model, but the most important is to pay attention to is the data. The other you can explore on your own. I'm now going to jump down to the next line and let this product collection get loaded. And as you can see, this product collection also has quite a few arrays in it, or properties in it. The most important of which for collections, anything that extracts or extends rather the variant data collection, is going to have an items property. And this is going to contain all the items, in this case all of the models in that data collection. And I can expand this, and obviously this is a model, so inside of here I can look at the data collection. This can be really helpful to find out what property or what items a collection is loading. So I would really encourage you, go in as you're trying to understand the system, fully explore all the nested properties. It can give you a lot of understanding as to how Magento works and how your custom code is working. The last thing I want to briefly mention is conditional breakpoints. I'm going to save this file and come back in here, refresh this sandbox page. As you can see, I just have a normal breakpoint set right here. Let's say on this order collection, I only want it to halt execution if a certain value is set. So I can come in here, right-click on the breakpoint, set breakpoint properties, and let's say I only want it to be set if product get name equals test1. I set that, then I go in and I click resume, and because the product's name is indeed test1, it halts execution. This can be really helpful when if you create a module that, or you're walking through code and you only want to look at a certain line of code, if a certain variable value is set, conditional breakpoints can be useful. So that concludes the overview of Eclipse debugging with Magento.